Black Flag Resynced has 3 visual modes on PS5, with a very typical performance, fidelity, and balance split. Comparing the performance and fidelity modes, the biggest feature-level excision is the removal of the RT reflections, which add perspective correct reflection detail to the world even when screen space information isn't available. The RT reflections bring out the detail in the ocean surface, highlighting the rough, tessellated formations on water. In a lot of games, that wouldn't be a huge deal, including in last year's Assassin's Creed Shadows, which didn't feature RT reflections on PS5 owing to framerate concerns. But in the Caribbean set Black Flag, their use adds much more to the game's visual signature. Getting there required substantial overhauls to Anvil's TAAU and denoising, and the reflections run at 1/4 resolution, but in the end, reflection quality is fine even on base PS5 hardware. Lighting elsewhere in the game is also dialed back. PS5 in performance mode dials back the use of shadow maps for distant structures and foliage, leaning on a screen space solution instead. The difference should be obvious in this comparison shot. When we occlude the tree line at the top of the screen, shadows beneath disappear, and if we do the reverse, shadows gradually draw in. The fidelity mode also makes use of screen space shadows, but their use is more additive in that mode. It's an interesting solution that typically looks fine enough on PS5. Head-to-heads and city areas reveal little visible difference between the two modes, but areas replete with vegetation can have a somewhat flatter, duller look in performance mode in some instances, though GI downgrades may be implicated at times as well. Shadow map resolution also gets a bit of a haircut in performance mode, with more obvious cascading behavior. The game's RTGI is preserved in performance mode thankfully, which means the performance mode has a pretty satisfying indirect lighting presentation on the whole. AC Shadows dropped RTGI on the PS5 performance mode entirely, relying on a baked probe-based solution that produced less than satisfactory results. In Black Flag, you can expect a broadly similar appearance across the two modes. That's not to say that everything's exactly the same. I sometimes noticed some differences in color temperature between the two modes, even on identical saved games, and there are some fairly minute differences in the appearance of shade in some areas. I'd also expect the performance mode may be a little bit more prone to RTGI artifacting owing to its lower resolution, though in actual gameplay both look quite stable. Then there are some more iterative cuts. Foliage detail seems to take a hit. Ground detail seems a bit less pronounced in performance mode. Strand-based hair is still used in cutscenes, but during gameplay, hair seems simplified and doesn't exhibit the artifacts associated with the strand hair. Cloth also takes a bit of a downgrade. The sails on these docked ships exhibit coarser, less lively movement than their fidelity mode counterparts. Ubisoft confirmed that cloth sims should be a little bit simpler in the game's higher performance configurations, an optimization to ease CPU strain. But I think I'm just scratching the surface. The Black Flag team mentioned thousands of settings that can be tweaked on a granular basis across consoles and modes through their platform manager. Settings are also adjusted depending on gameplay context, so on-foot gameplay and naval sections use different settings for instance. I'm really just getting at the big picture, general differences. Image quality is the last key visual divergence. Internally, PS5 in performance mode is usually good for about 1080p or slightly lower, while fidelity mode seems to be around or a bit below 1440p typically. The output imagery in performance mode is also quite a bit rougher, and has the appearance of a lower output resolution. The aliasing presentation in both modes is fine enough though, and the developers told me that substantial revisions to their TAAU, including the addition of an anti-flicker technique, was required to correctly resolve the game's macropolygonal details, and that rendering resolution should be somewhat higher than in Shadows, again to mitigate flickering issues. Frame rates here are pretty boring, and that's a good thing. Basically, as far as I can tell, the fidelity mode is essentially a locked 30 FPS throughout, and the performance mode is a locked 60 FPS. There may be some variance later in the game, but in my experience in capture, this is a very stable experience. Cutscenes are 30 FPS on all modes, though interestingly, the performance mode still doesn't feature RT reflections in these sequences, despite the identical update. Cutscenes do drop frames sometimes on camera cuts, but that's not unusual for a modern game. There's a third mode here, Balanced Mode, which targets 40 FPS at 120Hz output. It's pretty boring from a visual perspective though, in the sense that it targets largely the same settings as Fidelity Mode and looks very similar on the whole. Shadow resolution may be cut back a touch and there might be a few tweaks here and there, but I don't think there are very many obvious differences. Resolutions are actually very similar here to the PS5 performance mode, clocking in at about 1080p internally, though obviously visual features are superior in balanced mode. It does a good enough job of aping the fidelity mode, just with somewhat smoother performance and worse image quality. Moving on to PS5 Pro, the game leverages the Pro's faster GPU and more efficient RT acceleration to add RT reflections to the performance mode. It's a neat addition, though the reflections are a bit chunkier and more prone to aliasing than in the base console fidelity mode. Strand-based hair also makes an appearance during gameplay, which means that the game's advanced rendering tweakables are present on Pro in performance mode. Shadows, in contrast, retained RTGI in its Pro performance mode, but dropped both strand hair and RT reflections. Unfortunately, the PS5 Pro performance mode still relies heavily on screen space shadows, which is an imperfect solution for the game's dense forested environments. In most areas of the game, though, on open seas or in dense towns, it's barely noticeable. The fidelity mode is pretty similar between both machines in overall presentation. The RTGI does appear to be running at a noticeably higher resolution, producing sharper, more defined indirect diffuse lighting, but outside of that, any differences seem quite minor and hard to notice. Image quality is also improved hugely on PS5 Pro, especially in the performance mode, which resolves a crisp 4K-like image with excellent anti-aliasing. Sony's enhanced version of PSSR is largely to credit here, which is used on the Pro in all modes. Fidelity mode doesn't improve as much in image sharpness and detail over the base console, but it deals with aliasing and flickering much more effectively than that machine. This game is pretty hard to pixel count, but I think internal resolutions between all the modes are pretty similar to PS5. Frame rates in all PS5 Pro modes are just about identical to the base console, which is to say that they generally hit the game's performance targets. Cutscenes are 30 FPS, while gameplay is 30, 40, or 60 FPS depending on the mode. But there's one wrinkle here that I have to bring up. My initial testing indicated that PSSR was not in use in this title, because the game exhibited significant pixel crawl and anti-aliasing broke pretty harshly when we rapidly rotated the camera. These characteristics seemed more indicative of the game's TAAU than PSSR, which tends to anti-alias imagery effectively even when we break the game's temporal history. I brought my findings to Ubisoft and asked for comment, and several members of the game's technical team ended up spending quite some time trying to find the root of the issue. After some testing, they found that saves imported from base PS5 to PS5 Pro wouldn't engage PSSR, leaving the game with degraded image quality, which was the root of the problems in my own testing. To remedy the issue, you have to delete all save data for Black Flag Resynced in the console menus and start fresh on PS5 Pro, as starting a new game in Resynced itself isn't sufficient. Ubisoft told me that this issue will be fixed in the game's first post-release patch, which should arrive in the next week or two. But for now, users who have both PS5 systems should be wary of this issue. And if you want the best possible image quality, you may have to start fresh on PS5 Pro.